Hey everyone, welcome. This is the SEMA Collision and Refinishing stage, and this is SCRS Live. We cover a lot of popular topics. The one we're going to cover next is fourth stage and matte finishes. But before we begin, we want to thank our sponsors. If you see them walking around, shake their hand, and it wouldn't be possible without them. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce our panel. Ryan?
Yes, my name is Ryan Brown. I am the technical manager for the Western United States for AkzoNobel.
Jeff Wildman. I'm the OEM and Industry Relations Manager for BASF.
Michael Bradshaw. I'm the Vice President at K&M Collision in Hickory, North Carolina, and current Treasurer for the Society of Collision Repair Specialists.
My name's Kye Yeung. I own a shop in California, European Motor Car Works, and I'm a past chair for the Society of Collision Repair Specialists. So we're going to start off today with some issues that repairers and painters come up all the time. And one of the things that are happening in our industry right now is four-stage finishes. And we want to cover some good practices, but I think the main issue that we have is a lot of estimators need to be aware of the repair planning that has to happen when you get a vehicle in that is a four-stage paint. So I'd like to start out maybe with Jeff. Could you maybe give us some tips on what a repair planner should look for?
Well, the first thing really is, as a repair planner, you should be looking up that color formula right away when you see a car come in. Because with today's colors, the way the OEMs are going, they're using a lot of transparent finishes. And those transparent finishes it's really important what that undercoat looks like. And that's the first thing. If you understand what color undercoat you need, you could potentially change some of these four-stage into a three-stage, or even a three-stage into a base clear by using the right color primer as you're repairing the vehicle and prepping it. But it's really important as you do this to understand what's involved, what toners are involved, because we're also running into today to a lot of special toners that are required for some of these colors, which you may or may not have in your mixing system.
Excellent point. So Michael, obviously as a shop owner, what happens when you have a third-party payer come in and says, hey, we looked up that formula and it's only three-stage in this paint brand? What do you do when that happens?
Yeah, I think, we've kind of taken the stance at our shop that the paint brand that we use, that's what we're trained on. That's what we provide a lifetime refinish warranty on. And so in that event, if it was a four-stage in our paint line, then that's the way we're gonna apply it to the vehicle. And the biggest thing for us, as far as a third-party payer, is really trying to help them understand all the additional labor operations, all the additional material considerations when you're spraying a three or four stage paint. And like Jeff touched on, the special effects toners. That's just one thing you need to be aware of. The translucency of it. How many coats is it going to take for full coverage versus a typical paint color, which may be 2 to 3 coats. You may put 6 or 8 coats on. So the time, the materials, both in the preparation stages, the application stages, as well as even the flash time.
That's a good point too. So Ryan, obviously as a trainer in that capacity and with all the information you have, are there any tips that you can give a painter to have a successful refinishing operation dealing with four stage? What do they need to be aware of?
So I think a big thing to keep in mind is make sure you plan for the repair, make sure you take the time necessary to complete it properly, and also it's always good to take like a spare panel and kind of simulate the repair before you actually do it live on the vehicle. It does take a little bit more time and money and materials, but you need to know that you can pull off the repair successfully before you get started. And even part of the, when you look at the blueprinting, some of these jobs require more space to blend too, because there's much more layers to them, different amounts of coatings. So giving yourself plenty of room is always a lot more successful way to go about these repairs.
And like everything, follow the instructions of the manufacturer, right?
Very much so.
So in the process of using a four-stage paint, is there any type of special equipment, different nozzle sizes or anything like that they should be aware of?
Yes, it depends on the color. So outside of some of the reds and the different colors we see, there's also silvers. Nissan has one, Mercedes uses one, and they're like a leafing aluminum. They have like a metal appearance. it's very common to use a smaller nozzle size on those specific finishes than you use for the rest of your other colors. So it may require different equipment.
So, Jeff, I have a question for you. Did you want to add something
I
to
would
that?
say just one other thing to kind of keep in mind as you're doing this is, especially on bumper repairs with sensors and radar, how much paint can actually go over that. So that just goes back to, again, understanding what coatings you're putting on, and that letdown panel, like you mentioned, Ryan. Having a test panel to understand how many coats are going to go on that, because then you can determine, do we need to repair this bumper or replace this bumper?
So that leads to a good question. With these special toners, do they have a different shelf life than your regular toners?
For the most part, no. However, you can't say that for everyone, and I'll tell you why. We're working on a color for an OEM right now, and there is no toner available at the OEM level or the refinish level for this color. We're bringing in a new toner at the OEM level, which will then be added to the refinish level as a special toner for this one color and one color only at this point. It may have a limited shelf life.
Well, as a repairer and a painter, I know that we've experienced maybe using a product that wasn't an OEM paint and having difficulty doing that color match. So what you're saying that is it might be possible not to be able to have 100% color match if the right toner isn't used?
If the right toner is not used, in some cases with today's colors, you will not be able to match that color. And that's where, again, going back to some of these special toners that are out there that you wouldn't have on your mixing system. And when you look it up, it says special order. Again, you need to know that in that repair planning stage, because it may take you a week to get that toner in.
So, Michael, one of the issues that we have, obviously the IP estimating systems that we use, there's no calculation for 4-stage that I'm aware of. What do you do there?
That's really what the IP say is it's an on-the-spot evaluation, best reserved for the judgment. And in our shop, we've essentially used the 3-stage formula, the percentage add for the 3-stage formula to add an additional amount for the 4-stage. But again, the other considerations with the 4-stage is the amount of time spent on the front end for the color match process. It becomes extremely important because there's multiple tinting processes that are going to be required typically just to achieve a blendable match. So, not only the additional time for the application, but the front end work for the additional tint and spray out or let down panels that would be needed.
So obviously it's imperative for your repair planner to get compensated for that extra work to color match the card or do a letdown panel. Obviously it all goes back to that original repair plan if you're going to be successful or not. And obviously using a good product to achieve the best results, right? Anything else you want to add on that 4-stage paint process?
I think actually something that would be really helpful is maybe walk everybody through a typical 4-stage refinish process, Ryan, just so we can kind of lay it out so maybe they could better understand all the considerations that we need to think of as repair planners.
So if we look at what a 4-stage is at, say, the OEM level, most of the time it's a car going down the line. It's getting sprayed in potentially a color primer system or just a base coat, clear coat system. And then it will be kind of sanded down, a tinted color coat put on top, and then re-cleared. Some of this is going to be followed in the refinish world. There are times we can turn that into just a simple 3-stage, but there's also times when we cannot. A good example is like the Mercedes Alloy Beam Silver. It's just a silver color, but it's almost turned into a 4-stage because it requires black to be down first. You can do it with base coat, or you could do it with a primer system. You really need to spray the car, either the black or the silver. It needs to be clear coated, and then because of the way the leafing aluminum works, you've got to spend a lot of extra time, make sure everything's clean and well prepared, because you kind of have one shot to get it right, and you can't really rectify a lot of issues in that color. So it requires a lot more work. And then you have some reds that are the same way. They require like a color primer underneath to match what the OEM does. And then it goes through, you have a base coat. You can use like a tinted clear coat. Some require a mid layer with a tinted clear coat. So there's a lot of different scenarios depending on what the paint company does.
Well, you touch on a great point. So you might have a 3-stage color, but you get the best results maybe with a tintable primer or a ground coat. So what happens is that all of a sudden becomes a 4-stage color. And even though it might indicate that it's 3-stage, your technician's actually doing 4 stages. So that's another consideration for the repair planner. When you look up the code, to find the best results. That's a good point.
There are more and more colors that you're seeing today that if you don't have the right color undercoat, it doesn't matter how many coats of color you put over it, you will never get a color match.
Good point. Is there any questions on 4-stage before we move to matte finishes from the audience? Okay. So matte finishes, we're finding at our shop, there's more and more manufacturers, selling vehicles that have a matte finish. And unfortunately, as you know, they're very difficult to maintain, very difficult to match, very difficult to replicate in the aftermarket. So, we want to cover some best practices. Obviously, I know there's a lot of equipment out there, anti-static guns. Obviously, good housekeeping is number one. I wanted to just kind of bring up some scenarios. Michael, do you see matte finishes in your business?
Absolutely. And the sad part about it is it used to be pretty infrequent, but more and more manufacturers are using it. It's becoming far more prevalent. And, it is an extremely time-consuming process because of the level of cleanliness that's required in the booth that's just so far above and beyond even a normal refinish process. Because when if there's an imperfection in the matte clear, you're not gonna sand that down, you're not gonna nib it, you're not gonna be able to polish it out. What it looks like when it leaves the booth is what it's always gonna look like. So it is an extremely time-consuming process in our shop at this point.
Okay. So Jeff, what are you seeing as far as a ratio of what is happening out there with matte finishes? Is it becoming more popular, or is it?
It's becoming more popular with a lot of your higher-end vehicles. We don't see it so much on your everyday mainstream vehicles as much, but on your higher-end vehicles, we're seeing more and more matte finishes, and it's coming from the designers. The designers are coming back, and they want to stand out from the competitors. They want to offer something different. And again, color sells cars. That matte finish changes that color a little bit, and again, it brings people in to buy those vehicles.
So Ryan, what do you see as the most common mistakes out there that refinishers are having applying a matte finish?
I think some of it is just proper planning it's what needs to be done. A lot of the cars on the OEM side, when they're refinished, they're clear coated, sanded down, and then re-clear coated with a matte clear. This is skipped a lot of times for just time savings. They want to go directly over base coat. And kind of your point is you don't have a chance to rectify this finish with polishing. So your end result is what you're going to get. So it's extremely important to try and follow an OEM type process as much as you can, especially the larger the repair gets. That way it keeps a nice, clean, a little bit more even look. Some other things that we see kind of going wrong is people trying to rush them or not respecting the process. They're not difficult, but they do require a lot more time and planning. And if you follow those things, you can get a very nice finish with them. One thing I'd also like to add to that is the amount of time doing spray outs. So it's really important that painter does his own spray outs and make sure that that finish that he's getting is going to represent what's on the car, because just the way you spray one can change the gloss by small amounts. The lower the gloss gets on that car, the more difference you can see with the eye. When you're around 20 to 30 gloss units, you can have a couple points apart, you don't really notice it. When you go really low, it gets to be very visually different.
I want you to elaborate on that using a color meter and letting the audience know, like when it's a gloss level, what the human eye can see, or when it goes down to the lower matte finishes, how sensitive that can be.
So when you look at like a real matte finish, you're usually under what's called about 10 to 12 gloss units. Anything under that you consider would be like full matte. When you start getting down in that 5 to 6 gloss unit range, one gloss unit apart, you can visually tell a large difference. And the lower you go, the bigger it is. So when you go between, say, like 1 and 2 gloss units, it's massively different visually. Once you get above that 12 to 15, you can have a little bit more variation, and you don't really notice it as bad. when you're up around the 20 to 25, where you see like the BMW frozen finishes, you have a little bit more room to play with. And the number of matte finishes you do see are growing depending on where you live in the country too. I know, Kye, you're out in California. There's a large trend for matte finishes out in that area versus other areas in the Midwest where weather kind of makes it harder to maintain one.
So Jeff, how's the UV in matte finishes? Is it the same as a gloss level?
It's the same as a gloss as long as you're applying the right amount of clear. And sometimes we've seen, again, just like Ryan mentioned, you try and rush it. So maybe you're putting on thinner coats so that you're trying to keep the dirt down, or you're trying to keep from getting any type of imperfection. So it's really important that you get that film thickness, because that's where you get that UV protection.
So I deal with a manufacturer that actually paints the vehicle with gloss and then comes in and sands it and then applies, the paint and then the matte clear over it. So is that typical, or is that...
We see that at a lot of shops. They find it as an easier way to do it. They can put the clear on, and when you're dealing with a gloss clear, it's easier to see those imperfections. They can go and sand those out, sand down that gloss clear, put one coat of matte finish over it, and they come out with a better job in a lot of cases.
Okay. So what you're saying, let's say you're replacing a panel, should you make that recommendation as a feature that they should paint it and then put the gloss clear, sand it, and then put the color and then matte again?
You can do that, and then what you can do is blend with the matte clear, because like Ryan mentioned, there's a lot of things that can impact the gloss of that clear, how it lays down, from the way you spray it, from how close you are, temperature and humidity. All of those things will impact what that gloss is going to be on that matte clear when you're finished. So again, the more you can simplify that process, the better.
So Michael, so you get a matte car that comes in. What's the first thing you need to do? You need to try and color match it. Are you having problems asking to paint the whole side of the vehicle? Are you having problems? Can you just paint a panel?
Yeah, I think it's really so dependent, right? And so much of this can't even be trial and error, right? I mean, you may be able to paint one panel and hit it dead on, and it may look great. You may attempt to go down that road, and for whatever reason, are just unable to match it, that closely with that confined of an area, and then you may need to refinish more of the vehicle. So I think it's one of the considerations. It's really dependent on the shop's processes. Are you clearing those panels? Are you baking it? Are you sanding that clear, then applying a matte over that? Or are you applying the matte directly over the base coat? And so it's so dependent from manufacturer to manufacturer and vehicle to vehicle if we're able to do that or not. And I think that's the biggest thing, is there is no universal correct answer to this. It's going to be dependent on that vehicle. It's going to be dependent on the shop process. And so the amount of time that it takes me to do it may be entirely different than what it's going to take your shop or any other shop to do it. And I think that's the thing that the blueprinters really have to realize, is the time can vary greatly from one matte finish to the next.
So when you're building a repair plan and you're trying to appraise the value of what's going to be put towards it, what kind of guide is there? Obviously, IPs can consider just a refinishing time, but you just mentioned all these different things that you have to do to get the vehicle ready. How do you charge or get compensated for that extra work?
So I think one of the things we've been really successful with is, we try to take an educated guess on the front end, but what we find is a lot of times that guess is incorrect. So we've really worked with our refinish techs to do a good job keeping up with everything they're doing and tracking that time and accounting for it. Sometimes, at the end of the job, we're gonna do our best guess, but as a final supplement, we'll have tracked all the time, all the processes that are required for that repair, and then present that to the third-party payer. And the other thing, by doing that, we've documented throughout the process with photos and notes, what we've done, and they typically feel better about paying for it because it's documented and it's a known at that point versus something we're just trying to guess at.
That's good advice. So Another thing I want to allude to as far as, tips and stuff, Ryan, do you see abuses out there where a painter will mix, a matte clear and a hardener just using a paint cup rather than the scale? Do you see issues there?
Yes, we do run into that from time to time. Anytime we have someone do a matte finish, we always highly recommend mixing everything across a scale. The lower your gloss gets, the more the small amount of overpour or underpour of like a hardener can drastically influence that final appearance. And it starts with when you're doing your test panels. Make sure you do them exactly the same way you're going to spray the car, the exact same flash time, the exact same curing. Don't rush it. We tend to see people getting bad habits and try and rush the spray out process. That's really the foundation of the repair. If I follow that closely, I know that I can replicate that on the car. Everything I mix needs to be really on point, and you can come out with a very nice, repeatable finish by doing this. But anytime you have small influences like that, they can drastically change the outcome and make them very frustrating for people to do.
So I know that having used different paint products, there's some matte finishes out there that only have like a matte clear and a hardener component, and you can't really vary the matte stages with it. And then we have some companies that offer a matting agent that you can kind of move that gloss level around. So Jeff, you want to allude to that? What are the things that a paint shop could use to their advantage, having the capabilities of that?
Well, we go with the matte paste. And the reason being is your job as a refinisher is to match the finish on the vehicle. It may have been a 20 gloss or a 15 gloss at the factory or whatever number. What is it now? What is it when you're working on it? So this gives you a lot more flexibility. And again, it goes back to the importance of that test panel and spraying out that test panel the same way you're going to spray the vehicle. As far as even, is it a vertical or a horizontal surface? And spray the test panel that way so that you get the exact finish that you're looking for. But it gives you that capability now to add a little more matte finish or matte paste, or add a little less, so you can really dial it in to match that finish.
So one of the things that obviously a day-to-day issue that we run up with is you get a matte finish car and you got to match it. So we've just dealt with the matte clear on how to get that level. What about the color? It's because you're trying to match a matte finish and you're trying to see through this thing to see what the color might be. And as we all know, when it's a fascia panel, we get a lot of pushback to blend the adjacent panels, obviously. So one of the tips that we've done, if it's a panel that's going to be replaced, we'll clear it, and we'll take that formula. And now you have something shiny, and you can match that and use that with your letdown panel with the matte, and get a better chance at getting a color match. So, Michael, do you ever run into situations like, what's your painters do when that happens?
Yeah, and so we've done the exact same thing in our facility, and that's really it's almost a two-part process, and that's what's so unique about matte finishes. You've got to match the base surface, you got to match the base coat, the actual color, which is time-consuming enough, and trying to get that right is virtually impossible if you're trying to do it through a matte color. So making it a gloss, clearing a panel that you may be replacing is a really good tip. And so once you've got the color dialed in, then like we've talked about, now it's matching the gloss level or sheen that's on the vehicle, which is another process in an entirely different manner. And so I think as a blueprinter, you've got to be aware of that. There's not only a tint to match for the color, there's a process to match the sheen as well. That's an entirely separate operation.
So I know with our shop, we've had some situations where, like what Jeff alluded to, as far as mill thickness. Sometimes when, as a painter and been through that process, I know when you're laying down that clear or matte and it's looking so good, do you want to take a chance for that extra half mil, or do you want to leave it alone? Well, what happens sometimes is that with matte finishes, it really, obviously, you can't tell what it's going to look like until it gets into its matte stage. And we found that if you put heat to it, sometimes it'll cause some streaking because you're not really putting enough mill thicknesses on it. So we let it go and air dry for a little while and let it set. And then we'll put the heat to it, and then we eliminate a lot of that streaking. So that's a tip that we found.
That's actually some really good advice. one of the things when you're seeing one, you want to make sure it's going to flash properly between coats, let it go fully matte. And also, before any curing, before you bake it, you need to have a nice even look if you're going to put heat to it. But it doesn't hurt if you just want to let them air out naturally. That's perfectly okay, and it's a good way to do it. So I like that tip.
So, here's another situation that Ryan and I worked on. We had a vehicle that came in that had a matte finish, and they wanted us just to panel paint a certain color, a certain part of the car. And we experienced that additional mill thickness of matte in the blend changed the actual hue of the matte. So, that's the problem that we're always dealing with, is that, if you make a mistake and you have to come back and recolor that panel, and you don't want that extra thickness difference in mill thickness to show that difference, that's to allude to that same thing. You got to mix that matte finish with a scale so you can duplicate it time and time again. I know that we struggled sometime years past where our painter was using a mixing cup, and we had a problem. We had to come back and redo a certain panel, same paint, same everything, and it was a different gloss level just by using the cup and not a scale. So those are, good tips.
And with that point, usually the darker the color of the car, the more influence you can see by the layer thickness of the matte finish. So on a jet black car that's a really low gloss, it can be very sensitive to that, where you won't really notice it on like a silver or a white because it kind of hides it. So it's a very good point, and I think it's something that everyone needs to be aware of when they're repairing these things.
Well, I think that everything just speaks to how temperamental the process is, right? And again, I think that as a blueprinter, not being in the booth, right, not having that experience, not really understanding the temperament of a matte finish, I think is part of the struggle to capture and get paid for all of the operations that the refinish tech is actually having to do. So I think that's where communication in the shop becomes so important, right? Communication between the painter, the refinish technician, and the blueprinter to really grasp and understand the process and be able to explain that to the third-party payer.
And the other piece is communication with your customer, letting them know what you're doing here. I mean, just like when we talked about four-stage, a lot of times these customers paid extra to get that color. So when you tell them this is a difficult color or it's going to cost more, they will understand because they paid more to begin with, or they paid more for that matte finish. And again, when you say it's going to take longer to repair, they understand. And again, you're setting that expectation up front.
Yeah, Jeff, you hit it on the point. Some of the customers come in and we tell them the same thing. We kind of educate them on the process. They go, when I bought this car, they told us that this was the easiest finish to take care of, just to make the sale. So we've had that a couple of times. So it makes your job that much harder. So you have to explain those processes to them. So, you have anything to add, Ryan, on that?
No, I think it's a really good point that you made there. I mean, all these cars, they usually come with, like some of the matte finishes, you have to sign a document stating that, it's a different warranty than standard finish. When they buy these colors, there is an upcharge, and it's a really good point to point that out when you're doing the estimating that, there was a premium to this, so expect it to be a little bit more difficult than a traditional repair.
We found, too, on some brands that the size of the paint tip made a big difference on how that matte finish came out to replicate what was on that car. So some of them have a little bit of peel, some of them are flat. So that's another little tip that you might, as you're doing your letdown panels, or even talk to the manufacturer of the paint to say, hey, what's your recommendation? Always look at that TDS guide that tells you all the things on there and the information. So always read the instructions. We as guys have a tendency to skip that.
And that's a really good point. And also what I recommend that anytime they get a chance to go to a training center and get hands-on experience with it, we're always willing to do this stuff, every manufacturer is. Make sure you take the time out to get trained on it before one comes in your shop so you know what to expect versus waiting for one to show up and then trying to figure out what to do at the last moment, because it gets stressful. And when a painter gets stressed out, it's easy to make kind of a mistake that way.
So we're kind of wrapping this thing up. Are there any other questions that maybe things that, okay.
Yeah, I'm curious, when we're doing a tint on the center strata of our toning color, which is semi-transparent, but my letdown panel, I'm matching it to the existing vehicle that is already painted in 4-stage. How do I find my letdown panel to compare it to that middle strata of material?
I'm not exactly sure what you're asking. Are you referring to how do you find the ground coat color, the proper ground coat color, or?
If I'm tinting that color, if I need to adjust that color, how do I know that I need to adjust it? Because my vehicle is already painted in the 4 stratas, the 4 stages. Right. So how do I tint to one that's buried already? How do I find that strata to know that I need to make an adjustment in my tone?
Generally, what you'll find is you're going to do most of an adjustment on the ground layer, because usually it's like a metallic type color. The middle layer is generally not much pigmentation in there, and it generally doesn't change much either. So you'll either have to put more or less layers on, and you do that with the letdown panel. Very rarely you're going to start tinting around on that, because the middle layer doesn't have, it usually just provides some richness and more depth to it. Most of the work's done in the ground layer, and most of the time when a color's made, we tend to take a little bit different approach for the refinish world than what they maybe do at the OEM. So we'll always try and make our ground layer match as close to the final finish as possible, because it makes the repair easier. When I'm spraying something complete, I can have a little bit more color gap range, and I can't tell. But once I start having to try and blend a repair in there, if I've got a ground layer that's really far off from the final color, it makes that repair very difficult, and also trying to blend out that mid layer. So all the refinish companies take a kind of the same approach that way to make the repair easier for our end users. So most of the time, the mid layer is just going to be more or less. Very rarely will you actually adjust the mid layer itself.
So what we've had good luck with, obviously you follow manufacturer's directions on what the value of that ground color might be. And if you're still struggling with a color, we'll take a color camera and take a shot and call it a solid color. And that color camera will make a formula that's solid and get you in the ballpark, maybe a little bit closer. And we've used that.
Another good tip is, we have seen it, and I think you alluded to it earlier, we're getting more and more transparent finishes, so sometimes the correct answer is actually a E-coat type primer color underneath the whole finish. You can actually get a better match just by doing this. It seems kind of counterintuitive, but if you follow the process the same way and you start with the same color they did, it makes kind of a nicer repair, because that way, it's from the bottom up, it kind of mimics that. And I kind of think it has a nice look too when the primer is the same E-coat color. It looks like a nice repair starting off, so it's a good way to do them.
So anybody else on the panel like to add anything to our matte finishes, or you think we covered it pretty good?
I think the only other thing, maybe a tip and trick we could add for matte finishes is always pay attention to how your cleanliness is in a booth, like you talked about, but also how you mask the vehicle. Anytime you have openings around a fender where a light came out or something else like that, you want to make sure that everything's masked really tightly, because any kind of airflow going across that car that goes through these openings, you'll have a faster flash-off period around those areas, and that actually can change the gloss level, and you might see like a shadow underneath where an opening is if they're not masked very tight. It's something that people overlook a lot, but it can cause, it's going to be a repaint then, and that's never good. You would never notice it with a high gloss clear because it just dries shiny. But with a matte finish, a little bit more care has to be put into that, and also just the proper routing of the car when you're spraying it.
With that, I'd like to thank my guests and myself for doing this SCRS Live. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Kye.
everyone. I had a blast.
Thanks, everyone.